Montana Territory, March 1885. When Alexander Petrov signed of his selling a suicide stone fireplace and replaced it with a firebox no bigger than a bread loaf. Every man in the Bitterroot Valley thought the Russian had finally gone mad. The clay can traps and fed into a horizontal runoff stovepipe buried beneath a massive earth bench that stretched the length of his cabin wall. No roaring flames, no stuck cordwood, just one split log every X hours, and a family that never severed. What did this former stove builder from Village Vasto understand about combustion that every frontier settler had been getting wrong for decades? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you are gotten from. Alexander Petrov was around 9 years old in the spring of 1884 when he stepped off a Union Pacific freight car in Missoula with his geketso. Their two sons, Ivan, AO9, and Mikhail, AO6, and a leather satchel containing every dollar he did save in 7 years of laboring in a Pennsylvania coal mine. He did come to America from Village Vosto in 1877, not as a farmer or a soldier, but as a petic, a stove builder. In Russia, Petrov had spent a couple years constructing masonry heaters for villages across the eastern provinces. These WNT the open horse Americans favored. They were enclosed combustion systems with serpentine flue channels that snaked through massive clay and brick cores, extracting nearly every degree of heat from burning wood for the exhaust reached the chimney. A properly built Russian pizza could heat a house for 12 hours on a single firing. Petrov knew fire the way a clockmaker knows gears, not as a brute force, but as a system with inputs, outputs, and gates. He bought 80 acres in the Bitterroot Valley, 14 miles south of Hiver, for $1,25. An acre. The land was timbered, cold, and exposed. He built his cabin that first summer the way his American neighbors turned him to, a single-room structure of deca ponderosa logs, zinked with a lime mortar, a fieldstone fireplace against the west wall, a plank roof covered in cedar. 6. IT was on his work, solid BY frontier standards. The fireplace drew well and through good heat when you stood within the podium of IT. Then November came, and Petrov learned what every homesteader in the Bitterroot already knew, but never solved. The fireplace was a furnace and a thief at the same time. Standing near IT, you could drown your sins. The capodia away, water froze in the bucket. The fire consumed goo at a staggering rate, a full cord every 9 days through December. Petrov was hauling, splitting, and stacking 6 hours a day just to keep the cycle going. His boy slept against the fireplace wall, the only spot in the cabin above Sarada Pedemires. Cats or ham blankets from the ceiling to trap heat in one half of the room. But by morning, the entire space had degalazed to summer. Around 3 octomires. Frost formed on the inside of the door. The mortar between logs cracked and wind whistled through gaps faster than cats occupied them with rags and tallow. The problem doubly the cold. Petrov had survived in winters in Village Vasto that would bear Montana insane. The problem was the fireplace itself. An open hearth is the most inefficient heating system ever devised. BY man. The fire burns at 1,100,400 mires. F. But 70% of that energy goes straight up the chimney as hot gas. What little heat radiates into the room does so in a narrow cone directly in front of the opening. Here's the chimney draft. Pulls heated cabin up and out, creating a vacuum that sucks cool and air in through every crack and gap in the walls. The fireplace doubled is failing to heat the cabin. IT was actively cooling IT. Every frontier family in America was fighting the same losing battle, burning massive amounts of wood to feed a system that threw most of the heat away and would corner into. Repeat. They compensated with bigger fires, more wood, thicker walls. Nobody questioned the fireplace itself. It was how things were done. But Petrov had built something better in Russia. He rebuilt it dozens of times, and as he was his boy Hiver through January. Feeding logs into a stone mouth that swallowed heat and gave back almost nothing, he decided she was done heating. His home the American way. In February 1885, while the ground was still frozen, and the valley locked under the pόδια of snow, Petro began dismantling his fireplace. He pulled the stones out carefully, stacking them outside against the cabin wall. Katya goes without a word. The boys huddled under every blanket they owned, while their father tore out the only source of heat in the house. It took him 3 days to clear the hearth down to the foundation stones. What he built in its place would take $10 and cost him less than $8 in materials. The firebox was small, absurdly small by frontier standards. A vertical combustion chamber measuring just 80 inches wide, 80 inches deep, and the 80 inches tall, constructing from clay bricks he fired himself in a pit kill behind the cabin. The open and accepted one split log at a time stood on end. Above the firebox, a short vertical channel, the burn tunnel, rose the 36 inches before, turning horizontal into what Petrov called the heat riser, an insulating vertical column made of double gold clay pipe packed with wood as between the layers. The heat riser stood 3 inches tall inside a salvage steel barrel he bought from the general store in Steubenville for Exida. This was the engine of the entire system. The principal was combustion concentration. In a conventional fireplace, fire burns lazily across a bed of logs. Flames spread horizontally, gases escape up before fully combusting, and most energy leaves as gas. Pit of the firebox forced the fire into a narrow vertical column, where flames had nowhere to go but up through superheated air. The insulated heat riser maintained temperatures above Mia Diacosia meters at the top, hot enough to burn the smoke itself. Secondary combustion, the burning of gases that a normal fire releases unburned, happened inside that column. Water exiting the top of the heat riser dubbed smoke. It was near transparent exhaust, stripped of almost every usable calorie. From the top of the steel barrel, the exhaust dropped down and entered a horizontal run of octane clay pipe that Petro had shaped and fired in sections. This pipe ran the entire length of the south wall. The pόδια, buried inside a massive bench made of cob, a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and water that she packed around the pipe to a thickness of 8 inches on all sides. The bench stood the 8 inches and 36 inches deep, built directly against the wall. It looked like a long smooth earthen ledge. At the far end of the bench, the pipe turned upward into a short clay chimney that exited through the wall, not the roof. The total horizontal run from firebox to chimney exhaust was 22 πόδια. In a conventional fireplace, hot gases travel maybe 3 πόδια before escaping to sky. Petro was forcing exhaust through 22 πόδια of clay pipe surrounded by thermal mass before releasing it. By the time gases reached the chimney exit, they had surrendered nearly everything. Exhaust temperatures at the chimney measured barely above other ambient 40-50 meters in winter. That meant almost zero wasted heat. The convent was the storage battery. Clay and sand absorb heat slowly but release it for hours. 8 inches of cob surrounding the 8 πόδια of pipe created a thermal mass reservoir that guns heated would radiate warmth into the cabin for exit 8 hours after the fire died. The bench itself became warm to that as within 3 minutes of lighting and stayed warm through the night. Total materials cost $3 for the steel barrel, $2 for sand hauled from the river, $1.50 for straw, $1 for chimney hardware. The clay came from a bank on his own property. Labor, who was his alone, paid the gigs of work while his family shivered, building something new, one in the Bitterroot Valley had ever seen, and no one believed would work. The Toxtorty for Petro even finished the bench. A neighbor named Hank Colaltar, who ran cattle on the adjacent quarter section, rode over in mid-February to check on the family. He heard Petro had torn out his fireplace in the dead of winter, and assumed the Russian had suffered some kind of breakdown. Coulter stood in the doorway, looked at the tiny clay firebox, and the long earth amount running the length of the wall, and the bodachheid in his reaction. That is your stove, Alexander. My W's bread oven is bigger than that thing. You video T2. Boys in here, and you ripped out a perfect good horse for a clipper and a mud bench. What happens when it hits triada below next week? Petrov explained the principle. The concentrated burn, the heat extraction through the horizontal run, the thermal. Mass storage. Coulter listened the way man listened to Etzel explaining high. The sky is green politely briefly. Then he shook his head and offered to help Petro rebuild his fireplace before someone froze. At the general store in Stuyvesant, Coulter told the story to anyone who did listen. The rasant or ouchy fireplace built some kind of rasa mud oven the size of a boot, says say and hit the whole cabin with one log. The laughter was immediate and loud. A rancher named Tom Geldan, who'd been in the valley since 1870, called it the most foolish thing he'd heard in the Catesera years of watching greenhorns try to survive their first winter. Every man who comes out here thinks he knows better than the country. The country always wins. Give him till March, and he'll be begging for firewood like the rest of them. The surplus criticism came from a man who actually knew something about heating. Douglas Feng was a blacksmith in Stuyvesant who built or repaired every stove and flue system within triada metra. He made right out the obvious place. In early March, genuinely curious, Feng spent an hour examining the firebox, the heat riser, the horizontal pipe run, and the convents. His verdict was technical and damning. The concept ain't entirely wrong, but the execution will fail. That firebox is too small to sustain combustion in extreme cold. Your draw will reverse when outside temperature drops below -60, and the chimney exit can maintain enough differential. The coke will crack, moisture will build inside the pipe run, and you increase blockages within 2 seasons. And if that heat riser fractures, you'll have carbon monoxide filling this cabin with your family asleep on that bench. Fen, double imkin. He was genuinely concerned. He offered to sell Petro a cast iron box stove at cost $10 and help him install it that weekend. Petro thanked him and declined. Even Katya had her doubts, though she kept them quieter than the neighbors did. At the circle in town, Margaret Coulter, alias Hive, asked Katya directly how Ekti felt about sleeping her boys next to a mud wall connecting to a clay pipe. His answer became the most repeated line in the valley that winter. My husband built stove for years in Rasa. If he says the fire knows where to go, I believe the fire knows where to go. Margaret told 6 women. By the end of the week, every household in the South Valley had heard some version of the story. The Rasan who thinks fire knows where to go. The consensus was unanimous. Petro had made a desperate gamble with a foreign contraption that violated every principle of frontier heating. Small fires don't heat large spaces. Clay cracks in cold. Mud benches. Belong in peasant huts, not American cabins. The only question was whether he did rebuild the fireplace before his family duty heard or after. The cold came on March 11, 1885. Late season cold snaps in the Bitterroot Valley WNT unusual, but what settled over western Montana that week a snap. IT was aces, an Arctic high. Pressure system stalled over the northern Rockies, dragging polar air down through Canada and porking IT over the valley like a lid on a pot. On the morning of March 11, the mercury at the Stuyvesant reading post-read -octomires. FBI the Dodecates, IT had dropped to the Guinea. BY the Decateserates, IT hit the Tessera with wind gas. Out of the north at Sarada pede miliatinora. The wind silpus conditions past. Exeda. IT didn't break for 11 consecutive days. The temperature never climbed. Above, the K. Nighttime lows hovered between -28 and -3. The wind was relentless, scouring the valley floor, driving snow horizontally and stripping heat of every structure in its path. The valley escalations began to fail almost immediately. Tom W. Rand's house, one of the largest in the district, burned through. A cord of wood every 3 days. His hired man fed the fireplace around the clock. Insects, interior temperature held at 39 meters. W. moved the children's bedding into the main room and hung every hadeund across the windows. ITW. The water barrel froze all in the pόδια from the hearth. Hank Sirius Cowen ferned gears. His stone fireplace, regularly and properly drafted, soon overcome the wind hammering his west wall. Interior. Temperature dropped to 3 meters on the end of March the 8th. His gave heated stones on. The horde then packed them into the children's bedding. The boys slept in coats, cats, and boots. Coulter burned through his entire reserve by March the 8th in Gankatin Green. Timber engaged deep snow, hauling a tobacco on a slant behind a horse to cold. To stand still. Douglas Fenn the blacksmith kept his up. Stove running 20 hours a day. His cast iron box stove, the same model he did, often to sell petrol, consumed a quarter corn daily and held his up at Sarada Tesseris Mires. His house, heated by a second stove, sat at Saradaena. His wife stuffed rugs alone every bedboard and still walked to frost on the pillow. Across the valley, the pattern was identical. Families burning through winter reserves meant to last until April, men exhausting themselves, hauling and splitting wood in lethal conditions, children sleeping in layers, so thick they could barely turn over. Livestock suffering. Coulter lost 2 calves that froze standing against a fence line. Geldan found a chicken coop, where every bear had died overnight despite a lantern burning in the corner. And then there was the Petrov cabin. On the morning of March the 8th, the girl's day, of the seeds, Hank Coulter rode past on his way to cut emergency timber. Smoke rose from every chimney in the valley in thick, desperate columns, the signature of fires burning hot and constant, against impossible cold. But from the west chimney, the short horizontal exit on the south wall, Coulter saw almost nothing. A thing is, barely visible against the grey sky. So the first thought was that the system had failed completely, that the pipe had frozen, or the clay had cracked, or the fire had gone out, and the family was inside in trouble. He nearly stopped, but the wind was cutting through his coat, and she had 3 miles of frozen trail ahead. So he rode on, making a mental note to check on them that evening. He didn't know it yet, but what was happening inside that cabin was about to change how he understood heat for the rest of his life. Coulter came back that evening. He spent 10 hours cutting. Green pine and Ministry mirrors cold, his fingers numb inside double gloves, his horse stamping and snorting clouds of frozen breath. He was exhausted, half frozen, and genuinely worried about the Rasan family in the cabin with the wisp of smoke. He took his horse to the post outside and knocked. Katya opened the door. She was wearing a cotton house dress, no shawl, no coat, no scarf. Behind her, the cabin was lit by white oil lamps, even and males at the kitchen table working with a set of carved wooden blocks. They were in shirt sleeves. Coulter stood in the doorway, wind screaming behind him, eyes in his beard, and felt warmth pour out of the cabin like opening an oven door. Hank, come in. Close the door. You're letting the cold in. Katya said, the way you did. Say it on a cool autumn evening, not during the girl's cold snap in a decade. Coulter stepped inside and the door sat behind him. The warmth was immediate and strange. Not the aggressive face scorching blast of a roaring fireplace. Not the concentrated pocket of heat near a box stove that feigns to nothing octopodya way. This was even uniform. Therein, the cabin felt the same temperature everywhere he stood. Near the door, in the center of the room, by the fore wall. Warm, comfortably, undeniably warm. Alexander sat on the earth bench, against the south wall, mending a leather harness. He looked up and nodded. Cold one today. Speak for a moment. He looked at the firebox. A single piece of split pine stood on its end, burned quietly inside the small clay chamber. The flame was modest, almost gentle. No roaring, no crackling inferno, just a steady, contained burn, no louder than a candle in a lantern. What is your temperature in here? Coulter finally asked. Petru gestured to a spirit thermometer hanging on the north wall, the wall furthest from the bench. Exida and last I looked. Coulter walked to it. The mercury read exida meters. He turned around. Exida meters. He saw coming with the stone. Fireplace burning around the clock was sitting at the tria. His children were sleeping in goods. And here was Alexander Petru sitting on a mud bench, in a flannel shirt, burning one log at a time in a firebox the size of a boot, holding exida meters while the valley froze. How much wood have you burned today? Coulter asked. Petru thought for a moment. 3 pieces since morning. Maybe 4. I loaned one. It burns an hour and a half. I let it die. Down. The bench holds the heat. Load another when it cools. Maybe every X hours I add a log if we want it warmer. 3 or 4 split logs in an entire day. Coulter was burning Sarada to Penida times. That amount and losing the battle. She put his hand on the bench. It was warm. Not hot, not scalding. Warm like the stone in late afternoon. He could feel the heat radiating upward into his palm, steady and deep, the kind of warmth that comes from us, not flame. She moved his hand along the bench, warm for the entire length. The pόδια. Of gentle, constant heat. Feel the wall behind it, Petrov said. Coulter pressed his palm against the log wall above the bench. Cool, but not cold. Not the brutal bone-deep chill radiating from every wall in his own cabin. The bench was warming the wall itself. Coulter sat down on the bench. The warmth came up, through his legs into his back, into the frozen core of him. He sat there for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, Gary, I owe you an apology. Alexander. Word of what Coulter experienced inside the Petrov cabin spread through the valley within Sarada Octo. Hours. Most men did to live it. Exida meters on one log every X hours during the rare cold snap in a decade only like a 3 months after too much whiskey at the trading post. But Coulter, a man given to exaggeration. He was a catman, practical and blunt. And when he told the story at his blacksmith of Mars the Cassiates, he told it without embellishment. Exida meters one log. Task the beno yourself if you don't believe me. Douglas Van was the first to make the trip specifically to measure. He brought 2 calibrated thermometers from his shop instruments. He used for tempering steel, accurate to within a degree. He arrived on the morning of March the cocktails when the outside temperatures to the Munich CX meters F Petro let him without ceremony. Then placed one thermometer on the north wall furthest from the bench and the second on this wall near the door. He waited in 3 minutes for both instruments to stabilize. North wall penida 8 meters. East wall penida 6 meters. The firebox held a single log, half consumed, burning with a clean, almost smokeless flame. Then walked to the chimney exit on the outside of the south wall and held his bare hand near the opening. The exhaust was barely warm. He estimated Sarada pede to penida meters at most. In a conventional fireplace or box stove, chimney exhaust runs between 300 and 600 meters. Energy thrown away into the sky. The system was releasing exhaust barely above freezing temperature, which meant nearly all the heat generated by combustion was staying inside the cabin. Calculating the efficiency on the spot, a conventional fireplace captures roughly the capacity to equal all the heat energy produced by burning wood. A good cast iron box stove captures Sarada to penida tisecato. Based on the exhaust temperature and the interior readings, the estimated system was capturing somewhere between 85 and 90 tisecato. He checked his thermometer's dice. The numbers didn't change. Then did what any honest man does when the evidence contradicts his prediction. He sat down at Pedro's table and asked him to explain every detail of the construction. Petro walked him through the system. Piece by piece. The narrow firebox that forced vertical combustion. The insulated heat riser that maintained secondary burn temperatures. The 22 pόδια. Horizontal pipe run that extracted heat through surface contact with the surrounding cob. The thermal mass bands that stored and radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. When compared the numbers directly against his own household, his cast iron box stove, the best available technology on the frontier, consumed roughly a quarter corvu a day, approximately 24 split logs, and maintained sarada mia mires in his house during the cool snap. Petro was burning 4 to 6 logs per day and maintaining penida octo to exceed 2 mires. The math was staggering. Petro was using roughly 80% less wood, while maintaining temperatures 20 mires higher. When asked about overnight performance, Petro explained that he loaded a final log around 9 inches the evening. By morning, the firebox was cold and dead, but the band still radiated heat. KCCS thermometer. Reading at dawn on March decapitates the coldest night of the seeds, sown penida mia mires, with no active fire. The thermal mass had held enough heat through 8 hours of -34 exterior temperature to keep the cabin above penida. Fen wrote everything down: dimensions, materials, temperatures, consumption rates. He made sketches of the firebox, the heat riser, assembly, the pipe layout, and the band's profile. When he finished, he looked at Petrovens and something that would be repeated across the valley for years. I've been building stoves for a decade years. Every one of them has been throwing away more heat than it keeps. You build something that has almost nothing. He paused. I was wrong about this, Alexander. Completely wrong. The first replication happened before the cool snap even broke. Hand Coulter, still burning green pine around the clock end. Goats in his wood pile disappear, run to pay to Mars the canal with a simple question. Seeing you build one of these in my house? Petro said yes, but not until the ground thawed enough to dig clay. Coulter saw it take that long. He asked Petro to draw out the dimensions and explain the principal step by step. Petro spent an evening at sketching the firebox, the heat riser, the horizontal run, and the band's proportions on the back of a feed sack. Coulter started building a simplified version the next morning using fire brick salvage from his damaged fireplace and a section of cast iron stovepipe in place of clay. His bench was shorter, only the pόδια, and he used a mixture of river mud and straw instead of proper cob. ITWNT elegant, but by March 22 and IT was operational. The results were immediate. Celsius interior temperature rose from 3 mires to 49 mires within 24 hours. His good consumption dropped by more than half. The calendar is going US. The shorter band stored less heat. The stovepipe lost more energy than clay, and the firebox proportions doubled exact, but the improvement was undeniable. Celsius with Margaret, where to remove your coat indoors since March. Educates, stood in the kitchen without IT for the first time in decades and cried. By April, when the ground softened and life returned to something resembling normal, 3 more families had approached Petro for help. Tom Geldan, the rancher who decalled Petro's system, the most foolish in his in the Catesera years, was the second to build one. He didn't apologize for what he said. He just owed up at the road with arrogant, asked where the good clay bank was, and duty to work. Petro helped him with the firebox dimensions and the heat riser assembly. W insisted a longer bench, pόδια, that wrapped around a corner of their main room, creating a thermal mazat double sitting and a sleeping platform for the children. Douglas then took a different approach. As a blacksmith, he understood metal fabrication better than masonry. So, he built a hybrid system using a cast iron firebox with clearland interior walls and a steel pipe horizontal running cased. In cob, his version heating faster than pure clay design, but the IT whole and warmed clay is long overnight. he began hiring to build similar systems. For customers, $6 for materials and $4 for labor. Biwaizun, Hiddi. Completed 5 installations. The variations multiplying through the summer of 1885. One homesteader built his bench through an interior wall, SOIT heat into rooms from a sing firebox. Another extended his horizontal run to pόδια, snaking it beneath a sleeping platform instead of a bench. A widow named Clara Enstrom, who did nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite during the March seeds, had Gertinio some build a version using a jusqu'au did steel drum for the heat raiser, river stones packed in clay for the bench mass. ITW pretty, but IT. Werk. BY the winter of 1885 to 86, the 4 Cowins in the Bitterroot Valley had some version of POV system. Fuel consumption across those households dropped an average of exceeded 100 compared to the previous year. Not one family that installed the system reported interior temperatures below 40 octometers even during a 2-week cold stress in January that pushed nighttime lows to -28. Fenn, who had become the system's most vocal advocate after being its most credible critic, wrote a letter to the Territorial Agricultural Office in Helena describing the design and its measured performance. He received no response. The frontier data for official validation. IT validated. Through results, neighbor BY neighbor, cabin BY cabin, one gorm gintarate. Time. What Alexander Petrov built, he built the 1885 an invention. IT was a transition. He took principles that Russian stove builders had refined over centuries. Concentrated combustion, secondary burn, serpentine heat extraction, and thermal mass storage, and adapted them to frontier materials and frontier conditions. There are some PC, the traditional masonry heater that hit homes from Moscow to Vladivostok, operated on the same physics. Petrov simply stripped IT down to its essential elements and rebuilt IT with clay, sand, straw, and the excedent steel rail. The modern name for what she built is a rocket mass heater. The term WA until the Evans and Larry Yeni independently developed similar system for use in developing countries and of JD applications. Evans working in Oregon designed a compact combustion unit feeding into a horizontal mass bench almost identical in concept to what Petrov had constructed a century earlier. Rorksky, an engineer, focused on fuel efficiency for cooking stoves in Central America, refined the insulated heat raiser principle that forces secondary combustion of good gases. Neither man knew about Alexander Petrov, but both arrived at the same conclusion through the same physics. Small fires in insulating chambers burn cleaner and hotter than large fires in open spaces and long horizontal runs. Through thermal mass capture energy that conventional systems throw away. The principles Petrov applied are now standard in sustainable building science. Thermal mass heating, the use of dense materials like clay, stone, or concrete to absorb, store, and slowly release heat is a cornerstone of passive house design grade. Modern masonry heaters built in Scandinavia, Germany, and Austria operated although depended to an needed efficiency. The same range fencer in previous cabin. The Korean annual system, which channels heat beneath stone floors, uses the same horizontal heat extraction that Petrov ran through his bench. The Finnish contraflow masonry heater routes exhaust through multiple vertical channels inside a massive brick core before releasing IT, capturing heat through the same extended surface contact that Petrov achieved with pόδια of clay pipe. The rocket mass heater community today numbers in the thousands. Varied of JD builders, permaculture practitioners, and homesteaders on every continent have constructed variations of the system using local materials. Cob benches, earth and floors heating BY bed pipe, insulated heat risers made from vermilion air brick. The materials have modernized, but the physics haven't changed. A concentrated fire in an insulating chamber feeding exhaust through thermal mass before releasing IT remains one of the most efficient methods of heating a structure with solid fuel ever devised. Petrov System spread beyond the Beetle Valley in the years following 1885. Though never as a name technique or a formal design, homesteaders who had seen or heard about the installations carrying the concept to new claims in Idaho, Wyoming, and eastern Washington. Some built faithful replicas, others adapting fragments, echo bends here, a certain horizontal run there. The full system with specific firebox geometry and a selected heat riser required knowledge and lessons that not every builder possesses. Simplified versions produce simplified results, but even partial implementations outperform conventional fireplaces by significant margins. Alexander Petrov never left the Bitterroot Valley. He and Katya raised their boys on the Ogdoda-acre homestead, cutting timber, running a small herd of cattle, and living. Clearly, he built stoves for neighbors when asked, but never charged more than the cost of materials. He dared write down his designs or seek any recognition. When visitors asked how he did come up with the system, his answer was always the same. I didn't come up with anything. This is how we heat homes. In Russia, the fire does the work. You just have to give it the right path. He died in 1927. The cabin stood until 1958 when the property was sold and the structure demolished. Neighbors who helped with the demolition reported that the convents after the 3 years was still intact, dry, solid, and without a single crack. The story of Alexander Petrov is not a story about a stove. It's a story about the cost of assumption. Every man in the Bitterroot Valley assumed that heating a cabin meant building a bigger fire, more wood, larger hearth, hotter flames. The logic seemed heredity. Cold is big, and so the response must be big. But couldn't do it about the size of your fire. Cold cares about where the heat goes after you make it. And in every conventional fireplace in that valley, the answer was the same. Up the chimney, out through the walls, and into the infinite appetite of a Montana winter that would swallow every color you produced, and ask for more. Petrov, the fed the cold with force. He fought it with direction. He understood that a small fire burning efficiently in an enclosed system with its heat captured, transferred, stored, and slowly released would outperform a bonfire in an open hearth every single time. Not by a small margin, by a factor of 5, although that's a less good, ecosimiles gormar. A family inserts sleeves while their neighbors slept in boots. The difference doubled factor resources. It was understanding. The men who mocked him ain't stupid. Hank Cutter was a competent rancher. Tom Gelden had survived the Cathedral Montana winters. Douglas Fenn was a skilled tradesman who understood metal and fire better than most. They failed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they never questioned the system they inherited. The open fireplace had been the standard for so long that it had become invisible, not a choice, but a given, like gravity or weather. Petrov questioned it because he'd grown up with an alternative. He'd distinguished his own. Found that fire could be channeled, contained, and made to surrender nearly all its heat before the exhaust reached open air. He didn't need to be smarter than his neighbors. He just needed to have seen something they ain't. That is, the pattern that repeats across every frontier in every century. The people who solve problems most efficiently are rarely the ones with the most resources. They are the ones who bring knowledge from somewhere else, a different trade, a different country, a different tradition, and apply it where no one thought to look. A stove builder from village was to sit in a Montana cabin, watching it pour up a chimney and thinking, I know a better way, not a new way, a way that has been working for centuries in a places people have never been. Douglas Fenn, the blacksmith, who warned Petrov the system wouldn't fail, became its greatest advocate. He built more rocket mass heaters in the Bitterroot Valley than Petrov himself. Years later, when a new homesteader asked Fenn why he hadn't figured it out on his own, Fenn gave an answer worth remembering. Because I was so busy building what I already knew how to build, I never stopped to ask if it was the right thing to build. Alexander stopped. That was the difference. Today, somewhere in Montana, in Oregon, in Vermont, in northern Sweden, someone is loading a single split log into a clay firebox no bigger than a bread loaf. The fire catches, climbs the insulated riser, drops down into a long horizontal run of pipe buried in a earthen bends, and surrenders the heated veins across octo, dodeca, decocto pόδια of thermal mass. The exhaust exits barely warm. The bends radiates 4 hours. The cowin stays at exceed meters through a that won't freeze a conventional home solid. The physics area since 1885. The event it changed since the first Rasan Pizzi was built 500 years ago. The what it sent tomorrow. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And where is the coldest winter you've ever faced? Hit that subscribe button for one proven frontier technique every week. And hit the like button if this story changes how you think about fire and heat. Because sometimes the smallest thing in the right system will outperform the largest blaze in their own one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Such characters, names, and specific events are fictional while techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional